You're a 19-year-old American soldier in North Africa. The desert wind tastes like dust and cordite. You've been in the war for, what? A few months? Maybe weeks? Now you're stumbling back through a rocky pass, shell bursts chasing you. German tanks grinding forward where your buddies were standing 10 minutes ago. Overhead, someone yells, "Fall back! Fall back!" And somewhere on a distant ridge, a German field marshal watches you through binoculars and decides you are not a serious enemy. That's where our story begins. Because 3 weeks later, those same Americans will stand their ground against a veteran Panzer Division at a place called Guettar and force it to pull back. Same desert, same divisions, largely the same weapons. So what changed? How do you transform a shaken, humiliated army in just 21 days? And why was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, warning his own generals about the Americans, just as they were dismissing them as soft? Let's step into February 1943. North Africa is supposed to be the easy front for the Allies. Operation Torch has landed American and British forces in Morocco and Algeria. The newspapers back home are full of confidence. Hollywood newsreels show GIs smiling, petting local children, waving from ships. The United States has the factories, the men, the fuel. And yet, the first serious test against the Germans is about to become a nightmare. At the center of this storm is the US 2 Corps, commanded by a man named Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall is not a coward. He's not stupid, but he's the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. His headquarters is literally blasted into the side of a cliff, miles behind the front. He communicates through layers of staff, issuing long, confusing orders by radio, sometimes using code words he's invented himself. Subordinates joke that it takes a dictionary just to understand what he wants. Ask yourself, how confident would you feel in battle if you suspected the man in charge didn't see what you were seeing? Across the lines is a very different kind of commander, Erwin Rommel. He's already famous. British newspapers have been calling him the Desert Fox for nearly 2 years. Young German officers worship him. Allied soldiers curse him. But the Rommel of early 1943 is not the dashing young brigadier of 1940. He's tired. He's sick. He's fighting shortages of fuel, ammunition, even food. Hitler's orders are increasingly unrealistic. And now, in Tunisia, he has to juggle his own battered Afrika Korps with reinforcements sent by Berlin under a separate commander, General von Arnim. 2 German generals. 2 chains of command. 1 shrinking bridgehead in North Africa, and into this chaos march the Americans. For Rommel, Kasserine Pass is an opportunity. In mid-February, German and Italian forces smash into American positions in western Tunisia. The U.S. units are scattered over a huge area, perched on exposed hilltops, dug in shallow with poor mutual support. Most of the men have never heard a German tank engine. Their anti-tank guns are light. Communications are fragile. From the American side, it feels like a storm you didn't see on the weather report. Imagine you're there. You've been told the Germans are good, but beaten. One British officer may have even hinted that this will be a gentle introduction to the war. Then, before dawn, the fire comes in. Artillery first. Heavy, precise. The ground shakes. You taste dust in your teeth. Then the sound of engines. Deep, mechanical growls climbing in pitch. At Kasserine Pass, German panzers spear through American positions, catching units off balance, cutting off support, punching down the road network. Confusion spreads like wildfire. An American gun crew sets up a 37mm anti-tank gun and discovers, sickeningly, that at normal range their shells bounce off the frontal armor of German Mark IVs. Machine gun bursts whip across the rocky slopes. Casualties mount. On the ridges, observers see something they never imagined in training. American soldiers, some of them dropping their weapons and running. Others trying to hold and being outflanked. Headquarters frantically radioing orders that arrive too late or contradict each other. In 6 days, Tig Corps will take over 6,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. To Rommel's staff officers, poring over reports, this looks like confirmation of every stereotype they've heard about Americans. Brave individually, maybe, technically capable, but in their minds, soft, poorly trained, lacking discipline. In a letter home, Rommel describes the Americans in Tunisia as brave but very inexperienced, badly handled by their commanders, careless in their positions. He notes their tendency to scatter units, to neglect proper defensive works. But and this is crucial, Rommel isn't celebrating, he's thinking. He's seen this movie before. He remembers 1940, when raw French reservists broke and ran, but also when some French units, given time, fought stubbornly. He remembers British units that improved sharply after their early disasters. He has faced the Red Army, which in 1941 was a shambles, and in 1943 is learning very quickly how to beat his tactics. In his letters and reports, there's a thread that's easy to miss if you only look for contempt. Under the criticism is a warning. These Americans have good equipment. Their artillery, when organized, is dangerous. They have endless trucks, endless fuel. They're not short on courage, they're short on experience and leadership. Give them time to learn, Rommel suggests, and they will become a formidable enemy. But will his fellow German commanders listen? Hold that thought, because on the Allied side, Kasserine Pass lands like a punch to the gut. News of the defeat reaches Eisenhower's headquarters. Previously confident staff officers go quiet. British allies, many of whom never completely trusted American competence, raise eyebrows. Some are bluntly critical. The United States, that giant across the ocean, has just had its first major land battle with the Wehrmacht and lost badly. Now imagine you're Eisenhower for a moment. You're the supreme Allied commander in North Africa. You're juggling British egos, French politics, American inexperience, and the relentless demands of Washington and London. You cannot afford an army that collapses the first time it meets German armor. So what do? You change the leadership. Eisenhower and his British counterpart, General Anderson, start asking hard questions about II Corps. Why were units so scattered? Why was the headquarters so far back? Why were anti-tank defenses so poorly sited? Lloyd Fredendall becomes the focus. Whatever his personal qualities, the verdict is ruthless. He has to go. And that leads us to one of the most controversial American generals of the war, George S. Patton. When you hear Patton, what do you think of? Ivory-handled pistols? Profanity-laden speeches? The opening scene of a certain movie, it's easy to see him as a caricature, the swaggering, aggressive, old-school warrior. But the Patton who arrives to take over II Corps in March 1943 is not a cartoon. He's a serious professional soldier with decades of experience in cavalry, tanks, and doctrine. He has studied Rommel. He has read German field manuals. He has ideas about how Americans should fight. And he has 21 days. Patton steps into II Corps on March 6, 1943, with a simple, brutal mission: fix it. Fast. Let's pause here and ask a question that goes beyond World War II. In your own life, how much can you change in 3 weeks? A habit, a routine. Maybe. An entire army? That seems impossible. But Patton is about to prove that you can at least change its direction. From the moment he arrives, his presence is felt. He moves the 2nd Corps headquarters forward away from the safety of the cliff bunker, closer to the line where artillery can be heard and dust from the front line blows through the windows. He issues new orders about discipline that sound petty to some ears. Helmets will be worn at all times forward of a certain point. No soft caps. Weapons will be clean. Vehicles will be maintained. Saluting will be strictly enforced. Uniform standards will be observed. It's easy even today to roll your eyes. Why fuss about clean helmets when the enemy has tigers? But Patton understands something primal. Soldiers who look like an army will begin to think and act like one. Discipline in small things creates discipline in big things, like not breaking and running when the shells start falling. He doesn't stop at appearances. He drives out to units, sometimes without much warning, and inspects positions. At one outpost, he finds foxholes that are barely more than shallow scrapes in the sand. He orders them dug deeper, waist deep, chest deep. If you can't disappear into it when the mortar rounds hit, it's not a foxhole, it's your grave. For the men on the shovels, this is not an inspiring speech. It's blistered hands. It's fatigue on top of fatigue. Some curse him quietly, some loudly as soon as he's out of earshot. But 3 weeks later, for some of them, that extra 2 feet of depth will mean the difference between living and dying. Patton also changes how II Corps thinks about fighting. Under Fredendall, American units were often scattered across picturesque hilltops, each one vulnerable, each one hard to support. It looked impressive on a map, but it diluted combat power. Patton insists on concentration. Positions must support one another with overlapping fields of fire. Artillery must be tied into infantry defense plans. Communications lines must be laid out carefully, with redundancy. Reconnaissance must be aggressive, not timid. He brings in Omar Bradley as his deputy, a quieter, more methodical officer who translates Patton's urgency into clear orders and training programs. Together, they drill the Corps. Patrols are pushed out daily. Officers are told to learn the ground like their own backyard. Artillery units practice time-on-target missions firing from multiple batteries, so that shells arrive at the same moment on a German advance point. Think about that. Same guns, same shells, but instead of individual batteries firing uncoordinated, you have several battalions hitting the same target area at the same instant. For the enemy under that barrage, it feels like the sky has dropped on them. No new technology required, just doctrine, planning, practice. While this is happening, Rommel is leaving the theater. His health is collapsing. He is exhausted. Berlin decides to pull him out. On March 9th, he departs North Africa for good. Before he goes, he leaves behind an assessment. The Americans are not yet a first-rate enemy, but they will become one. They learn quickly. His caution is not universally shared. Back in the German High Command, there is a temptation to shrug off Kasserine's meaning. Some officers believe they've seen the true face of the American soldier, luxuriating in supply, easily rattled under fire, lacking the philosophical toughness of the German Lanzer or the Soviet peasant. Von Arnim, in charge of the German 5th Panzer Army in Tunisia, prepares his own operations with this picture in mind. He has seen American units run. He has read reports of poor cohesion. Why would he expect that to change in a few weeks? On the Allied side, Eisenhower watches II Corps closely. There is pressure to sideline the Americans, to let the British 8th Army under Montgomery take the lead, while the Green Yanks learn the ropes in quieter sectors. But if the United States is going to be a major player in Europe, it has to be blooded somewhere. It has to prove it can learn. Tunisia becomes that proving ground. Patton's reforms are not universally loved. Picture a GI at a dusty tent, scraping its stubble with a dull razor because Patton's orders say he will be clean, shaven even in the line. He mutters to his buddy about old blood and guts, being crazy. He jokes that Patton wants the Germans to admire their haircuts as they bayonet them. In the next breath, that same GI pulls on his helmet because he knows a patrol is going out in an hour, and the man who shows up bareheaded will have a bad day with the platoon sergeant. Some of the men who resented Patton the most in March would, years later, admit that those 3 weeks changed everything. Not by magic, by making it impossible to pretend they were still in training. While Tuckenkorps is being hammered into shape, the wider campaign grinds on. To the east, Montgomery's 8th Army has pushed Rommel back from El Alamein and is battering against the Merith Line in southern Tunisia. To the west, American and French forces are stabilizing after Kasserine, tightening the noose on the Axis bridgehead. German resources are stretched. Supply from Italy is under constant Allied air and naval attack. Tanks lost at Kasserine are not easily replaced. Yet one more blow might break the American spirit. Or at least, that's what some in the German camp hope. The battle that will test Patton's 21 days of reform comes at a place most Americans have never heard of, El Guettar. Let me ask you something. If you were a German general looking at the map in March 1943, what would you see? You'd see Montgomery's army coming up from the southeast. You'd see Allied pressure from the west. And in between, in the central sector, this reconstituted American II Corps, still green, still unproven. If you're von Arnim, wouldn't you look at that and think, there, that's where we'll hit, that's where they broke before. They'll break again. That mindset sets the stage for Guettar. By late March, Patton has moved 22nd Corps into positions to support the British drive on the Marath Line by threatening the German flank through central Tunisia. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, digs in near the small village of Guettar. The ground is harsh, rolling hills, rocky wadis, scrub brush, not the endless open desert of Hollywood. It's a defender's country if you use it well, and a killing ground if you don't. This time, the Americans are determined not to repeat Kasserine. Foxholes are deep. Anti-tank guns are dug in and camouflaged, their crews drilled and red-rilled. Minefields are laid out along likely approaches. Artillery batteries have pre-registered targets, ready to fire at coordinates the moment observers call. U.S. engineers have worked day and night to wire up the approaches. Units are closer together. Lines of communication have been improved. Ask yourself if you could teleport one of those men from Kasserine to these positions. Would he recognize his own army? On March 23, 1943, the test comes. At dawn, the German 10th Panzer Division attacks. From the American side, the first warning is the growl of engines in the distance and the faint dust trails on the horizon. As the sun climbs, the shapes solidify. Tanks, dozens of them, infantry and support. For the Germans in those panzers, there is a sense of déjà vu. They have already smashed through American lines once. Why should this day be different? The answer comes when the first wave hits the minefields. Explosions rip through the German spearhead. Tanks are crippled, tracks blown off, hulls torn. Then the American anti-tank guns open up, hulls torn. Then the American anti-tank guns open up. Where at Kasserine many guns were badly sighted, exposed, or firing piecemeal. Here they have clear fields of fire across the channels the Germans are forced into by the terrain and the mines. American gunners hold their nerve. They let the lead tanks come into effective range. Then they fire, methodically. Some shells still bounce off frontal armor, but flanks are exposed in the confusion. Tracks are damaged. Optics are shattered. One hit doesn't have to kill the tank. It just has to stop it. And over all of it, the artillery fire begins. This is where those 3 weeks of practice pay off. Observers call in fire missions that bring down coordinated barrages from multiple battalions. Time-on-target shells arrive together, exploding in the midst of German attack formations. From inside a German half-track, it must have felt like driving into a wall of metal and fire. For the American infantry in their foxholes, this is still terrifying. They are not suddenly fearless super soldiers. They are men with dry mouths and shaking hands, clutching rifles, listening to rounds snap overhead, feeling the ground jump under them. Some pray, some swear, some just stare, waiting. But this time, most of them do not run. Patrols move to forward positions to harass and slow any tanks that make it past the initial kill zones. Machine gun teams shift position, covering gaps. Officers and NCOs shout, sometimes physically pushing panicked men back into position. It is messy. It is bloody. But as the day wears on, something becomes clear to both sides. The Americans are holding. From von Arnim's perspective, this is not what was supposed to happen. His panzers are taking losses they can't afford. Air support is limited. Ammunition is not infinite. The element of shock is gone. He faces a brutal calculus that every German commander in 1943 is beginning to taste. Do you trade precious tanks and trained crews for gains that no longer seem decisive? In the end, 10th Panzer Division pulls back. Guettar is not a Hollywood victory. There is no triumphant charge, no enemy army annihilated. American units have taken real casualties. There are wrecked Shermans and abandoned guns on the field. But the essential truth is unmistakable. The same II Corps that shattered at Kasserine has now stood its ground against one of Germany's better Panzer Divisions and forced it to disengage. How do you think that feels that evening in those foxholes? Picture a GI passing a canteen to his buddy, both of them covered in dust and sweat, ears ringing from hours of artillery. They've seen medics hauling out wounded, seen tanks burning on both sides. One of them lights a cigarette with shaking hands. "Did we just stop them?" he asks. The other shrugs, still processing it. "Looks that way," he says. Then, after a moment, "Guess old blood and guts wasn't completely crazy." Back in German headquarters, the tone of reports begins to change. There is still criticism. They still note American tactical mistakes, clumsy coordination, reliance on firepower. But woven into the dry language of war diaries are phrases that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Stubborn resistance, improved artillery coordination, rapid adaptation. Rommel, watching from afar now, cannot help but feel vindicated in his warning. The Americans, he had said, would learn. Given time, they would align their industrial strength, their technical skill, and their raw courage into something cohesive. Guettar is one of the first clear signs that this process has begun. After the war, German generals are interviewed by Allied historians. One of them, Hasso von Montefiore, reflects on the various enemies Germany faced. He talks about the Red Army's sheer toughness, the British soldiers' doggedness. Then he says something that surprises many listeners. The American soldier, he notes, may arrive on the battlefield green and clumsy. But he learns quickly. He absorbs new tactics, new procedures with a speed that is exceptional. Add to that the flexibility of the American command system, the willingness to replace generals who fail, the readiness to experiment with doctrine, and you get an enemy that evolves from battle to battle. From Kasserine to Guettar to Sicily to Normandy to the breakout at Saint-Lô, you can trace that learning curve. But Tunisia is where German overconfidence and American optimism collide directly. We began with a question. How do you change an army in 21 days? By now you've heard at least part of the answer. You don't swap out all the tanks. You don't magically conjure new divisions. You take what you have frightened young men, tired officers, battered equipment, and you change how they think, how they move, how they work together. You enforce standards that feel petty in peacetime because in war they become habits that keep people alive. You concentrate your strength instead of spreading it thin to cover every hill. You practice artillery coordination until it's second nature. You force your headquarters to live with the sound of the guns. And maybe most importantly, you make it impossible to pretend that the last defeat didn't happen. Patton did not erase Kasserine. He used it. He told his officers bluntly that there would be no more running, no more panic. He backed that promise up with training, with forward leadership, with the kind of presence that made men feel watched and, in a strange way, protected. Does that mean Patton alone won Guettar? No. It was won by artillerymen who had learned from bad barrages at Kasserine, by engineers who had learned how quickly German tanks exploit soft ground and weak wire, by junior officers and NCOs who had vowed not to let their platoons disintegrate again. But without a leader who believed they could change in 3 weeks and who demanded it, they might never have been given the chance. Now, let's go back to Rommel one last time. In popular memory, he's locked in a duel with Patton, thanks in part to post-war mythology and Hollywood. In reality, they never met on the battlefield. Their paths crossed only on maps. Rommel's real duel in Tunisia was with the clock, with Hitler's strategic fantasies, with Allied logistics. When he looked at the Americans in February 1943, he saw both weakness and potential. Some of his peers chose to see only the weakness. They looked at Kasserine and said, "Ah, that is the American army." Rommel, the professional, looked at the same battlefield and said, in essence, "That is the American army today. Tomorrow, it will be different." His warning that they were dealing with an enemy that could and would learn was ignored at peril. And that, perhaps, is the quiet lesson of this whole story. Underestimating any opponent because of what they were yesterday is a dangerous habit. So let me turn this back to you for a moment. If an entire corps can start to reinvent itself in 3 weeks under pressure, what does that say about what's possible for a person? Or a team? Or any system that's willing to admit failure and actually learn from it? We often talk about World War II in terms of hardware, tanks, planes, guns, but Guettar reminds us that doctrine and leadership, mindset and adaptation can be even more decisive. Same weapons, different outcome. Because people changed. Because someone forced them to. Because an enemy who thought he knew them suddenly met a version of them he didn't recognize. If you had stood on that Tunisian hillside in February and again in late March, you would have seen two very different American armies. In the first, men ran from a past they barely understood. In the second, they held a line they had helped build against a foe they now knew up close, personal, terrifying but not invincible. That evolution is why when German generals were asked after the war which enemy learned fastest, they didn't say the British or the Soviets. They said the Americans. All because somewhere in the space between Kasserine and Guettar, the humiliated army decided it wasn't going to be humiliated again. So when you hear someone mention Kasserine Pass as the great American disaster, remember to add the next chapter, Guettar. The place where 10th Panzer Division discovered that 3 weeks can change everything. The place where Rommel's warning about underestimating the Americans started to come true. And maybe the place where the U.S. Army truly began to grow into the force that would, 2 years later, be driving into the heart of Germany itself. War, in the end, is a merciless teacher. The question is never whether it will teach you. The question is whether you will learn fast enough before the next test arrives. At Kasserine, the answer was no. At Guettar, it was yes. What do you think made the difference? Let me know.